In this section, we're going to get through our last set of boring config for the Postgres deployment and its associated cluster IP service. So I'm sure you don't need any clever or witty comments from me at this point. I'm sure you just want to get this stuff done. So let's get to it. I'm going to flip on over to my code editor. Inside of my K8s directory, we'll do our Postgres deployment.yaml file. Now, again, this is going to be a file that's very much identical to the Redis stuff that we just put together and even the other different objects we had put together before that. I still do not recommend that you ever do a copy paste of these config files just because it's so incredibly easy to forget to update some specific property. Far safer to just rewrite it, but that's just my personal opinion. All right, so we'll do our API version of apps v1 for our deployment. This is going to be an object with a type of deployment. We'll set up our metadata, if I can spell it correctly, with the name of Postgres deployment, and then we'll set up our spec that's going to configure the deployment itself. So I again want to only have one replica running of my Postgres container inside of its given pod. Just very much like our Redis deployment that we just put together, we technically can create Postgres in a sort of cluster of different instances that are going to all work together to increase the availability and bandwidth of our database. However, again, that's something that's kind of outside the realm of Kubernetes that we're talking about right now, so we're just going to focus on running a single replica as it stands. After that, we'll put down our selector. We're going to say look for a label that is matching component Postgres. We'll then set up our pod template. So we'll give it a metadata property with labels of component Postgres. And then again, I'm going to make sure that I unindent back to be on the same indentation level as metadata. We'll define our spec for all the different pods that get created by this deployment. I'll say, here's our list of containers. I want it to have a name of Postgres. I want to use the image Postgres. And then finally, we're going to set up the ports here as well. So the default port with Postgres, which we are using, we're not going to reconfigure or anything like that. We'll set up a container port of 5432. Again, default port for Postgres. All right, so that looks good. Now remember, very similarly to all the like Redis and Express API stuff that we had done previously, to get our Express and our worker pods up and working correctly, or more specifically the containers inside there, they need to have that set of environment variables that are going to make sure that they can successfully connect to this copy of Postgres. So we do have to set up a little bit of environment variables, not only inside of this file, but inside of the worker and server deployments as well. We're going to take care of that in just a second, but for right now, I want to first put together the cluster IP service, and then we'll come back and talk about all these environment variables and this PVC thing and all that stuff. Essentially, I just wanted to get the boring parts out of the way here at the very start of these repetitive config files, and then go over to the more interesting stuff like the environment variables and the Postgres persistent volume claim. All right, so that's our deployment. We're going to also make inside of our K8s directory the Postgres cluster IP service.yaml file. And inside of here, completely identical to the Postgres one we just, or excuse me, the Redis one we just put together, I'll do an API version of v1. We are making a service that'll have a metadata name of Postgres cluster IP service, and we'll give it a spec with the type of cluster IP. And then finally, to make sure that, or not finally, we have two other properties due here, but one of the two is going to be the selector, where we'll tell this thing what set of pods it's going to look for, and as usual, we'll give it component along with the name or the label that we had applied to it, which was Postgres, as we can verify back inside of our template section over here inside the deployment. All right, so now the real last step, for real this time around, we're going to set up our ports. We're going to say the default port of 5432 to connect to Redis, and we're not going to do any type of remapping this time around as well. Target port. There we go. All right, so that looks like it's just about it. Now let's take these two new configuration files and we're going to apply them to kubectl as well. And then we'll check out our different sets of pods and make sure that everything is running successfully before we start to come back and take care of the Postgres persistent volume claim thing and some environment variables as well. So at my terminal, still inside of my complex directory, We'll do our kubectl apply K8s. And now we should see that we have the Postgres IP service and the Postgres deployment as well. So just as before, we'll do our get pods. And now one of these names is really long, so it wants to kind of wrap the levels with me. So I can see my Postgres deployment right here. The container is being created. I'll do get pods again, and I can now see that it is in fact up and running for the Postgres deployment. And I'll make sure that I do my get services as well. And somewhere inside of here, Postgres cluster IP service. Very good. And I got port 5432. All right, so I think that we are pretty much all set. So that's just about it on our very basic, very simplistic config files for all the different deployments and associated services. So let's take a pause right here. When we come back to the next section, we're going to talk about some additional work that we need to do to make sure that the server can connect to Redis and Postgres, and to make sure that the worker can connect to Redis as well. And also, let's not forget this little PVC thing down here. Okay, so quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.